Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. With over 200 million people aged between 15 and 24, Africa has the youngest population in the world, and that number is expected to double by 2045. Although Africa's economy has expanded rapidly in recent years, youth development still faces key challenges like unemployment, xenophobia, and equal access to quality education. Are African youth ready to assume leadership of the world's most dynamic continent? What are the imminent challenges for them, and what are their perceptions on Sino-African ties? Today, we are very happy to be joined by three elite African youth representatives: Mr. Malama Mavila from Zambia, Ms. Liberata Rushego from Tanzania, and Ms. Amina Jasso from Kenya. But before we start the interview, let's look at this.
Africa, a continent blessed with seemingly limitless resources, has enjoyed fast and steady economic growth over the past decade. Africa's GDP growth is expected to strengthen to 4.5% in 2015 and 5% in 2016, after subdued expansion of 3.5% in 2013 and 3.9% in 2014. According to the African Development Bank, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is also the fastest urbanizing continent globally, with a growth rate of 3.4%. Almost 40% of Africa's people live in urban areas. However, Africa's progress is being compromised by new and emerging challenges. Chief among these are its low resilience to natural disasters, energy crises, worsening poverty and unemployment, especially among young people, accounting for 60% of all unemployed Africans. In most African countries, youth unemployment occurs at a rate more than twice that of adults. And according to the African Economic Outlook, on average more than 70% of Africa's youth live on less than $2 per day, the internationally defined poverty threshold. With both opportunities and challenges ahead, the African Consensus concept was born in 2011. Annually, the African Consensus Forum brings together multiple stakeholders from civil society, government, academia and the business sector to share experiences from other regions facing similar challenges. The Youth Forum is one of its mini-forums that gives an opportunity for young people to discuss and share their experiences.
Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Ignorance may constitute a prejudice. I've never been to Africa, so I may have some not very healthy bias against Africa, although I do love Africans, and they are our brothers and sisters. So tell me briefly, what would be the most likely prejudices that we may have? What are those unhealthy biases that need to be overcome before we can have possibly an objective and complete picture about the new Africa?
I believe that, what has happened to Africa in the past, of colonization and famine and hunger and war, these are images of an Africa in the past, and I believe that now, with African youth that are exposed to the globalization and are redefining Africa, the interaction between, let's say, people who've not been to Africa, like you and me, and we're able to redefine the idea of what Africa is.
If you give me 5 words to describe the hope of Africa, what are the 5 key words?
Youth is definitely one of them. Development.
Development.
And
agriculture.
Agriculture.
Yes, for me, I think maybe I'm biased because of my current studies, but I do believe that, like it's always highlighted in most development reports, that Africa is an agroeconomy. Mm-hmm. So when you combine the key issues, things that usually arise is the youth and agriculture, of course, because the two tie strongly to the issue of unemployment.
You know, one of the key words in the vocabulary of the present-day young man of China is entrepreneurship, and I love the idea of having more startup companies. Does that mean that the digital technology would not help create a wide and yawning digital gap between Africa and the rest of the world? Do you think digital technology today helps youth in your continent create jobs themselves?
I think, okay, sorry for cutting you in, but recently when we had the African Consensus Youth Forum, I had the privilege of talking about some of the key issues that are facing youth, and one of them in agriculture is that the issue of markets. Now, the issue of ICTs, or information communication technologies, and how they are playing to improve the lives of young people is that, for example, young farmers, and it's very common in Kenya and Tanzania and Zambia as well, that young people now can use the social media for productive activities like advertising their crop. If they are growing tomatoes or vegetables and my tomatoes are ready, I can send pictures of my tomatoes to my friends. And that in its own is one way in which young people in Africa are tapping into the use of ICTs and technologies to make their lives better.
It sounds like what is happening in the first and second tier cities in China. Is that so in Africa? The social media is used by more and more young people.
Most definitely. I think it's very true. I had a friend the other day who was selling sardines. It's like a certain kind of processed fish, very, very small ones, and she used Facebook because we have Facebook at home, and yeah, she did get a lot of responses, whether or not it's where she gets them from or how people can get it from her. So I think they are definitely using social media.
What about the rate of illiteracy and the issue of poverty in Africa? Because when Mr. Kofi Annan was the General Secretary of the United Nations, he came up with the idea of a Millennium Development Goal. This year witnesses the realization of this goal, if possible. Have you ever heard of this concept?
Especially Kenya, we have achieved the Millennium Development Goals, and we are ready to go into post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And in terms of like illiteracy, Kenya has had free primary education, so access to primary education has been increased, and a lot of children are able to access this basic education.
You seem to have a very strong and a positive idea and opinion about the President Kenyatta's achievements after he took office.
Yes, I do. Yes.
What about the issue of poverty reduction in your country?
In my country, well, I think it's pretty much the same in that the government is definitely trying to reduce it in a number of ways. And in terms of, well, if it's education per se, yes, there are more schools being built for primary and tertiary education. And in terms of, even in terms of, as we say before, entrepreneurship and stuff, there is, I think there is more awareness to the fact that the very things that are needed to elevate the lives of people are being provided, whether it's through programs or through policy frameworks.
What do you think of the consensus, quote unquote, about the importance of education and enjoying equal access to the opportunities of education?
Yeah, and I think for me...
Because I raised this question in the context that Africa is home to 6 out of 10 of the world's most unequal countries.
Yeah.
Perhaps most of them are located in the sub-Saharan region.
Yeah, I think for me, and it's actually a very good question and coming at a very critical time in Africa's development. You see, in spite of the progress we have made with the Millennium Development Goals, that a lot of young children are now learning and they're able to read and write. So that's a big achievement on its own. But I think when it comes to education in Africa, we need to move beyond people being able to read and write. There are a lot of people in Africa who can read and write. But as to whether the education they have received in the past 10, 15 years is an education that equips them to be able to find and identify opportunities to move them out of poverty, that's another question. Because at the end of the day, you can read novels and all sorts of things, but if you cannot read the development ideas, you cannot read the opportunities that exist in your environment, then that's a problem. Recently, the Zambian government decided to change the curriculum in such a way that what the children are learning in schools should be now more practical. They need to do things that if they drop out of school at high school level, for example, they would be able to say they become a carpenter or they become a blacksmith, things like that. That's more practical. In the past, we've not had that. So you have a lot of people who can read and write in the streets, but that's about the only thing they can do, and that in that regards, illiteracy doesn't mean anything.
It seems what you guys have said indicates silver lining of the African continent. It indicates the hope. But European media seems to be doing just the opposite. If you look at the front page story of Economist, and if you watch the BBC, each day they talk about the desperation of some of the Africans who want to cross the Mediterranean to the other side of the ocean, for example, to seek new life in Italy, and most of them are drowned, and that's a big tragedy. More and more European countries want to step in, to intervene, to stop the snakeheads. What do you think of such stories?
Well, I think that it's, most of the people who are trying to immigrate are from countries that are war-torn maybe, and they have, issues, they have clashes, they have,
Libya, for example.
Right, and Mali. But you see, the problem is the leadership. If we have a good leadership in such countries, that we can solve these issues and there can be hope.
Wait a minute. Following the Arab Spring and
Yeah.
particularly the campaign of decapitation, the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi, it
Right.
seems democracy is looming larger, and therefore young people may have a hope. But what happened in Libya was chaos and killing of the former American ambassador to Tripoli, and tribal of different tribes still lingers and persists, threatens to disrupt the normal life there,
Yeah.
while people from different tribes vie for powers.
Yeah.
Do you think democracy is a good therapy?
Well, I think democracy, the whole idea that, these words that are being used to define the things that work in Africa, I think it's time we stop using words that have already been set and we find something that works for us. We can learn from China.
Give me a break. I don't think China is a universal example that can be easily copied.
No, I do not mean that we should copy what you have, but I mean that we should copy the fact that you did not take somebody else's, you designed something that worked for you. And I believe that Africa and every country should develop what works for them, and not just sort of take
This is a very good
democracy in
point.
its own.
What works for China at this moment, and this stage of economic and social development, is the strong leadership of one party.
Right.
But this immediately comes under scrutiny from the West,
Right.
and it immediately draws strong criticism from Western media about having a one-party political system.
Right.
They say this is radically different from a combination of liberal democracy with a liberal market economy.
Yeah.
Unless you do that, you won't succeed. But
Right.
China has quickly become the second biggest economy. So, do you think there is a third way other than dictatorship and democracy?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm going to give a practical example since we're talking about the realities of what we have seen in Africa. In the year 2006 in Zambia, we had national elections which brought to power, which re-elected rather President Levi Patrick Mwanawasa the late. And then unfortunately the president died in the year 2008. Now when the president died in 2008, we had to have elections to replace the president. So that means we had elections in 2006, we had elections in 2008,
Right.
then we had elections in 2011. Unfortunately, we had elections this year in January. So in the space of 6 or 7 years, we've had about 4 elections in Zambia. Now, democracy is a very good idea. It works in certain societies, and it's proven not to work effectively in certain societies because it's a system that in which the society or the cultural norms and all those things play a role as well. So I think that, like she said, we cannot say that we want to copy the Chinese example. We cannot also say at the same time that Africa should copy the Western